All right. When the novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie was growing up in Nigeria, she was not used to being identified by the color of her skin. That changed when she arrived in the United States for college. As a black African in America, she was suddenly confronted with what it meant to be a person of color in the United States. Race as an idea became something that she had to navigate and learn. The learning process took some time and was episodic. Adichie recalls, for example, an undergraduate class in which the subject of watermelon came up. A student had said something about watermelon to an African American classmate who was offended by the comment. I remember sitting there thinking, but what's so bad about watermelons? Because I quite like watermelons, Adichie said in an interview with Terry Gross, host of NPR's Fresh Air. She felt that her African American classmate was annoyed with her because Adichie didn't share her anger, but she didn't have the context to understand why. The history of the transatlantic slave trade was not taught to students in Nigeria. Adichie had yet to learn fully about the history of slavery and its continuing reverberations in the United States. Race is such a construct, she said, because you have to learn what it means to be black in America. So you have to learn that watermelon is supposed to be offensive. Here is an excerpt from her third novel, Americana. People were flattered to be asked about themselves, and if she said nothing after they spoke, it made them say more. They were conditioned to fill silences. If they asked what she did, she would say vaguely, I write a lifestyle blog, because saying, I write an anonymous blog called Race Teenth or various observations about American blacks, those formerly known as Negroes by a non American black, would make them uncomfortable. She had said it, though, a few times. Once to a dreadlocked white man who sat next to her on the train, his hair like old twine ropes that ended in a blonde fuzz. His tattered shirt worn with enough piety to convince her that he was a social warrior and might make a good guest blogger. Race is totally overhyped these days. Black people need to get over themselves. It's all about class now, the haves and the have-nots. He told her evenly and she used it as opening sentence of the post titled, Not all dreadlocked white Americans guys are down. When there was a man from Ohio who was squeezed next to her on a flight, a middle manager, she was sure, from his boxy suit and contrast uh, collar, he wanted to make what she meant by lifestyle. He wanted to know what she meant by lifestyle blog. And she told him, expecting him to become reserved or to end the conversation by saying something defensively bland like, the only race that matters is the human race. But he said, ever write about adoption? Nobody wants black babies in this country. And I don't mean biracial, I mean black. Even the black families don't want them. Thank you.
Could we give another hand for Tess Montgomery, please? Thank you so much. Okay, now I'll introduce Carolyn Holbrook, who will be in charge of the rest of the evening. Carolyn Holbrook is a 2015 recipient of a Minnesota State Arts Board Arts Initiative Grant. It was named a 2015 Changemaker by the Minnesota Women's Press for More Than a Single Story, which you all are here at. She was the 2010 recipient of the Minnesota Book Awards Case Sexton Award. Her personal essays have been published widely, most recently in Blues Vision, African American Writing from Minnesota, which is a great book, and forthcoming in A Good Time for the Truth, New Writing on the Realities of Race in Minnesota, which is also going to be awesome. I'm just going to stop saying awesome because all this stuff is awesome. Sorry. Her book, Ordinary People, Extraordinary Journeys, How the St. Paul Company's Leadership Initiatives in Neighborhoods program changed lives and communities, was published in 2013 and 2015. She founded Sassy, The Right Place, in 1993 and served as its executive artistic director until 2006, when she spearheaded its merger with Intermedia Arts. In 2005, she designed the Givens Foundation for African American Literature's Writers in the Schools program. She is the founder of the writing group Twin Cities Black Women Writing. She teaches at Hamline University, where she won the Exemplary Teacher Award in 2013, and at Minneapolis Community and Technical College. She is also a 2015-2016 mentor in the Loft Mentor Series. And the last thing I'll say about Carolyn is most of us already know she's done such great work and has changed the literary arts scene and the community here for the better for all of us. And so please give a warm hand to Carolyn Holbrook.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming today. Spending a beautiful Sunday afternoon with us. It's so nice outside today, and here you are with us. So, if you were here for either of the first two programs that Bao talked about with the African American writers and Caribbean writers, then you know that the seed for this series began with a comment made by a white audience member after my writing group read at Birch Bark Books several years ago. A comment that made me want to someday make a contribution toward changing the perception that lumps all Black people together as though there's only one voice from which we speak, as though there's only one Black experience. I'm grateful to have the opportunity with this series to follow my dream of helping dispel that myth of the single story. Thanks to the Loft and the Artist Initiative grant that Bao told you about, I was able to write all summer, but I was also able to conjure up this series. Conversations with Bao and with Sherry Fernandez-Williams here at the Loft informed me of their As Curated By program, which has given me amazing support for this series. Thanks, Bao and Sherry and the Loft. And because of this program, as Bao also mentioned, we are now change makers, according to the Minnesota Women's Press. So if you attended either of the first two discussions, you're aware that these are huge conversations that we're having, much larger than we can do justice to in an hour or two. So I'm delighted to tell you that we're working on continuing the series. And not settled yet, but we're definitely working on it. And the continued program will feature women from all the communities of color and will include panel discussions, readings, writing workshops, and book groups, featuring books by the authors whose work speaks to the issues that we will be discussing. So look for more about this, maybe in the middle of the summer. So, as my granddaughter Tess read in her intro to the excerpt from Americana, Chimamanda Adichie grew up in Nigeria and was not used to being identified by the color of her skin. And we know from the excerpt that changed when she came to the United States for college. As a Black African in America, she was suddenly confronted with what it meant to be a person of color here. The history of the transatlantic slave trade was not taught to students in Nigeria, so she didn't know until she got here the full extent of slavery and its continuing reverberations in the U.S. race, in the U.S. Race as an idea became something that she had to navigate and learn, as is true of some of our speakers in today's program. So if you have not seen Adichie's powerful TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, I urge you to do so. Among other things, she says, so that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing and only one thing over and over again, and that is what they become. As I mentioned, our first two programs featured African American and Caribbean writers. Today, we're going to the roots. We're featuring women who represent the various parts of Africa: Nigeria, Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia. As you will see, even though some of them were born here in America, their stories are rich and varied, not at all a single story. So the way it's going to work is that we're going to have the discussion for about an hour, hour and a half, then we'll take a brief break. We'll come back and they will all read from their work. They're also going to read little snippets from their work as we, go through the discussion. And then afterward, we'll have a reception with refreshments. So as Bao probably mentioned, you have their full bios in the program that you picked up on your way in. So what I'm going to do is just share their names as they come out one by one, and you can read their bios in the program. So Julia Nekesa Opoti from Kenya. Lula Saleh from Ethiopia and other places. Kare Mugo from Kenya. Nemo Hussein Farah, Somalia. And Adobe Akulowe from Nigeria. Ain't we beautiful, y'all? So, we're just going to have a conversation based on a few questions that we discussed. And they're also, as I said, probably going to intersperse some snippets from their readings along the way as well, from their writings, I should say. So, you come from different backgrounds, although you all have roots in Africa. Could you tell us a little bit about yourselves and about how your identity informs your writing? And we'll start with Adobe and just work our way through to Julia.
Thank you. So I'll start with the snippet.
Can you use the mic or?
Oh, Adobe. As he crouched against the side of a hub at the central station, the morning assembly of pantsuits and castrating heels reminded Uche he needed to get downtown to set up before lunch rush. His eyes were an unmined coal buried under the layers of oiled black skin. He wiped loose any crust caught on his fishnet beard and stammered to his feet. Slowly, he inhaled the light scent of whiskey sprayed into the lapels of his armless suit jacket and began his ceremonial begging to get him onto the next express downtown. Nkolika broke through the window as the nail tore off the hem of her skirt. She ran ferociously, breasts fighting each other, buttocks clamoring for air while clinging onto a wooden spoon she used to make his pounded yam. Wow. So the question, how does my identity inform my writing? I think it's a matter of how the type of writing I choose to do or how I use words. For me, it's very I like to code everything. At least that's what I've been told. That I'm not very explicit around what I'm trying to say, and I think as of recently, I really thought that probably is coming from my Igbo heritage. So I'm Nigerian, but my heritage is Igbo, and there's an admiration of conversation, and there's an admiration of proverbs, which is a very key way of being considered a great conversationalist. How you're able to use proverbs, and the coding that happens in those things. So I think I take that element oftentimes, and I weave that into my writing.
Okay. Nemo.
Hi. You guys look so amazing. Thank you for being here. It's Sunday. I would say that what informs my writing is really honestly just unpacking. Just trying to find intersectionality or connections between like all the different persons that one is throughout their day, throughout their life. Being here in America, I was like born across the world, and so now that I'm here, I'm like, who have I been? What does that all mean? How do I capture the stories? How do I unpack them? How do I allow them to inform my life right now? And so that's I think one of the reasons it's really trying to find healing for myself and trying to find a place for myself in the world. I will share this little snippet. It's not part of what I'm going to read later, but it's I think the medium that I'm exploring the most right now is poetry, although I write other things, but I feel like I express myself mostly through poetry because of how abstract it could be and how relatable it could be to so many people. So yeah, this is called switching. Today I switch codes many times through clothing and words, hijab on, hijab off, hair out, hair covered. I decolonize myself by speaking Afkohoyo. Remember, said my AAO. Something she once told me, remember always, is Aruri, gather yourself. So I gather and grieve many selves.
Wow, okay. Hooray.
Hi, my name is Hooray Mugo, and I am a writer and a storyteller. I'm going to open with a piece. Do you remember being hungry? Do you recall the thirst for blood, nose sniffing, teeth gnawing, a rumble in your belly? Pulse slow down in anticipation of the meal to come. Do you remember? I do. I remember the hunger that poured itself forth in alphabets and syllables, piecing itself together in eagerly consumed words that were spewed out of old typewriters and antiquated pens, words that were placed on my plate to be eagerly devoured, all the while the hunger roared on. A primal hunger emerging from the primordial need to be spoken into existence, seeking myself in others' words, collecting them so that I may stitch them into a semblance of me, yet never finding they were enough. I come from a very long history of oral tradition of storytelling, and that I think is predominantly why I write. Storytelling is a means of preserving the past, imagining the future, and really speaking to the present. I think the experience of growing up also in a non-Western country in Kenya really exposes you to human vulnerability at a very young age. America has a very clever way of covering its worst off, and in Kenya we still haven't discovered those mechanisms. So you are always sort of given a very accurate picture of what could happen in the worst case scenario, and that really informs my writing. Yeah.
Wow. All right. Lula.
All right. I'm going to start off with a poem. It's titled, I guess, Ode to East African Women. East African women are strong women, resilient women. They are women who work, who struggle, who strive. They are women who look at life with humor for the many things they have survived. They are women who represent multiple stories and identities, women who carry not just themselves, but their families and entire communities. East African women are the storytellers and the artists, the entrepreneurs and the writers. They are the carriers of the culture, traditions, and identity of their communities, of hair braiding and coffee making, of cloth weaving and injera baking, of incense burning and of wisdom, of healing, culture bearing, and story making. When I think of a strong East African woman, I think of my mother and her mother, my aunt and my great-grandmother. I think of my sisters, I think of myself. I think of the Somali strangers I make eye contact with on the bus, or the Ethiopian elders I see walking down the street near my house, or my Eritrean aunties who gather in jovial celebrations at weddings, or my friend's Oromo mother who is always asking us to come over to dinner. I think of the cultural similarities and differences we have. I think of the many women who conspired together to raise me and make me who I am today. I think of the matriarchs that I am surrounded by, their strength and willingness to face everything with fierceness and courage. They say that behind every great man is a strong woman. Well, I believe that the reason so many men are considered great is because they are with women who sacrifice so much of themselves so selflessly, and East African women are no exception. If anything, the sacrifices of East African women is too much the rule, and I am always in awe and appreciation. So I would say that for me, again, my name is Lula Saleh, and I'm Eritrean Ethiopian, but grew up in Saudi Arabia, so those are the identities that I carry. And I would say that for me, the way my identity informs my writing is, kind of what Nemo touched on in terms of intersectionality and personhood, because I think that, and this isn't just limited to being like East African, but I think that being in the diaspora, being an immigrant or a child of immigrants, being black, being all these things, you kind of have to carry all of these different worlds with you. And what ends up happening is that, like, for me, like, writing is a way to make sense of all of that, and the ways in which, like, I have to navigate all of these different worlds. And also to Nemo's point about personhood, it's just really interesting that, like, just kind of noticing myself, like, how I present when I'm, like, with my cultural community, how I may present when I'm with my religious community, how I might present when I'm with my peers, maybe like how I speak when I'm with all people of color, like black people. It's just like you constantly, I guess code switching is the word I'm looking for. And so for me, I feel like that really informs my writing. Just writing is a way for me to make sense of all of those, influences and things that I'm like experiencing on a day-to-day basis. And also I would say like, just the women in my family really influence who I am as a person, but also in terms of just what the things that I like to write about. It's very much informed by my mom's struggles, my grandmother. I'm gonna read a poem later for you guys about the coffee ceremony from like my grandmother's perspective. So yeah, I really like to highlight just women and femininity and just the presence of like matriarchs in my community, because that's something I'm very like passionate about. So.
And Julia.
I have my own version of the miracle of Minneapolis, and it is a celebration of the ways in which immigrant communities in Minnesota in grassroots ways are continuously changing the landscape of this city. I'm interested in the shadow systems created by people of color in this country when most institutions exclude them. Often when we talk about communities of color, we discuss disparities. These are certainly important, particularly as we look at how racism, classism, and xenophobia leave many of us on the margins. However, there is another kind of wealth, a wealth that cannot be measured by economic and other achievement indices. How does an immigrant interact with the choices of food at their local grocery store? With narrow stock choices, many of us find the grocery store lacking, despite the abundance in American grocers. I've been a resident of the Whittier neighborhood for about 5 years now, and have lived in Minnesota for almost 15 years. As an immigrant who was raised in Kenya, I'm always exploring, marveling at the new, but also familiar. I'm always in search of that reminds me of home. And so that's actually how I exist in my multiple identities. There's not a single day that goes by without me not thinking of home or of people that I know, or always seeking the familiar. And in terms of identity, I have always explored and interrogated what my identity means, even when I was growing up in Kenya, because as a biracial Kenyan with complex colonial history, there's always been places where I haven't fit in, or places where I've been pushed out because of languages that I don't speak, or because of a perceived exoticness. And so coming to the US and then experiencing that, but also in a very different way, has also, influences. So not just what I write, but when I interview people and talk about people's lives, I'm always curious about how you find yourself in whatever space that you occupy. And so one of the things too, I feel like oftentimes we're expected to behave a certain way, or to occupy just one identity, and that erasure can be very traumatic for a lot of people, and so it's something that I feel, I need to myself also constantly remind myself, this is who I am.
This is what my identity, this is what I bring in. When I think of like my names, I have a lot of names. The most public ones are just three names, but they all carry such a rich history of who I am, and if we have time, I might talk about that later. But it's like I mentioned, there's the colonial aspect of that history. There is the migration of my own family from different parts of India and Eastern and Western Africa, and then of course my migration to the U.S.
Ooh, wow. So there's a lot going on in these responses. We talk. We giggle a lot.
We're all friends in real life,
Yeah.
so you'll see that chemistry sort of playing out.
Yeah. So you've talked about coding, you've talked about code switching, you've talked about multiple identities that we all occupy. You've talked about intersectionality and personhood, human vulnerability, strength and struggle of, women from wherever we are, and navigating all the worlds that we occupy. So could you all just talk a little bit about your intentions for your writing? With all of what you said, do you write to heal? Do you write to reach out to your own community, to multiple communities, to people in the West? And also in that question is, are there issues that you tend to write about consistently or that you tend to avoid? And third part of this huge question is, what about issues that people in the West expect you to write about? Do you feel pigeonholed to write about something that is not something that you care to write about? So anyone can start. Go ahead.
This is Julia. So I actually started writing, I think when I was 10, because I'm the oldest of four, there are four others behind me. And I used to write to entertain them. So I actually would write, I published a lot of novels. So, and when I say published, I published them in my mother's house. So it was, because I needed to read my own books, and they wanted my attention, so that I wouldn't pay attention to them, I wrote them stuff so that they could read. And sometimes there were summaries of adult books that I had read, because I also sneaked and read books that I shouldn't have been reading. and so, but also Kenya has a very strong history of, like in the education system, of promoting essay writing in both Swahili and English. We read a lot of literature, and I don't want to romanticize it because this is not the reality of a lot of Kenyans. But for me, that was it, and so I wrote a lot. Now, coming to the States, and so then I'm also a storyteller. Like I find the most normal, ordinary things to be very interesting, and I will retell that story. If someone else was with me, they might not think it was that interesting, but for me it was, So coming to the States, I started writing for a small African paper, again with the interest of storytelling, in the interest of not finding those stories in the media and figuring out how can I change that narrative.
Was that in Minnesota or
yeah,
somewhere
here
else?
in Minnesota, yeah. So it still exists. Carrie actually writes for them. Chalet. So it's coming from, so even looking at Kenyan media, reading the newspaper, growing up, and then coming to the US and then not seeing faces or stories of people who look like me was very jarring, and so I wanted to participate in that. I studied economics in college. I had no interest in being in media, but here I am. So, and then in terms of expectations, to be honest, I got so frustrated with the local media here and got into a lot of uncomfortable discussions with people. And so I'm not interested in that anymore. I'm just going to do what I want, tell the story that I want. A friend of mine keeps saying people are dying out here, and to be honest, I'm not interested in negotiating my humanity or negotiating why this story needs to be told. I mean, I'll criticize it and I'll come at people, but in my own work, I'd rather just frame whatever narrative, whatever I'm interested in talking about or writing about.
So those frustrations had to do then with expectations the media had that they expected you to write, like, or to cover stories that you weren't interested in, or what?
Yeah, so we're on record, right? I won't mention.
You don't have to respond
No,
if you don't want to.
wait. I won't mention the publication, but I had a very interesting interview with a publication about 10 years ago, and I'm in this room where I'm being interviewed. So I was working at the African paper, and most of the questions they were asking me are what I call deficit questions. So there were questions about the African community, the sort of like, why are boys joining gangs? Why are girls getting pregnant? Why blah, blah, blah. Like, it was all, and halfway through, I realized, because they had an intern write all my responses on the board, and then they also didn't want to give me a byline. I was going to be like, that was that expectation, because I want us to imagine that we know we exist in all different capacities. So there has to be a better way of us storytelling that, and I'm specifically coming from a media perspective where I demand that you, again, accept my humanity with all its flaws as well as its, gloriousness.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Yeah, I kind of relate to what you're talking about, Julia, in terms of work in the media, so in terms of my writing journey, I'll talk about that a little bit and kind of get to your question, Carolyn. I've always been writing too. Like, I think I remember like writing like little like books that I used to do when I was like 7 or 8 years old, just for myself, and they're about really mundane things like polar bears and like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know, Christmas, and it's like kind of weird when you think about it, but those were the things that I was reading in school at the time, was like these very like Eurocentric narratives. So that's what I was writing about, but I was always writing. And then I think sometime in like middle school or high school, I started writing more for myself, like keeping a journal, and also just writing about family things. I came from a family that, we had domestic violence, so I identify as a survivor and a daughter of a survivor. And so for me, I think at like that age, writing was a way for me to, process some of those things that were happening. And, but then when I came to the States for college, I went to the U, I started seeing some of those things that, Julia was talking about, just media narratives and like representations of people of color, women of color, Muslims and things like that, that just seemed really off to me and, racist. And I didn't really have the language or necessarily the articulation at the time, but I knew that there was an imbalance in terms of which narratives were being represented and whose perspectives were being written about in our media, both local and national. So I decided, I love to write, I want to tell stories, I want to change the narrative, I'm going to be a journalist. So I studied journalism, and that's kind of been my base. But in the last few years, I've written and like interned for some like local papers and things like that. But increasingly, I felt very frustrated with journalism as a whole and how just how I guess like dominant media tends to represent our communities, and I mean, you see it locally in terms of just like how, like just one example, I don't really want to talk about the article because it's like triggering, but there was an article on the front page of City Pages like a couple weeks ago. It had a Somali woman in like full, hijab, and I don't remember the headline, but it was something about like FGM, or female genital mutilation, in the Somali community. And I just immediately saw it and just felt like, really, like, is this the best you guys can do? Like, are we really still talking about these issues? I mean, there's so many things that you could be talking about the Somali community or the East African community, and yet you want to focus on like you know, this one issue. And I feel like it's because that's the white gaze and like how the white gaze operates is like always pick the negative stuff, always pick the stuff that makes our women look like victims. You know, it's just like the same tropes that you keep seeing again and again. And so for me, like, I'm not Somali, but like being, you know, Eritrea and Ethiopia also have, you know, these issues, but it's not like as crazy as they tend to make it sound. You know, that like frustrated me, right? But so I guess getting back to the question, I felt like I've needed to distance myself from that sort of writing and like the journalism community, and then that's where creative writing has come back into my life. And so that's been a really great outlet for me in terms of writing. And what was the second part of your question again? Something. Sorry, it was a big question.
I know
trying
it
to figure
was.
out in my head. I'm like, how can I connect the dots for you guys?
It had to do with your intentions for your writing.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
so I was getting there. So
So working backwards to the.
I know,
Yeah.
working backwards. So for me, I felt like my intentions have actually changed over time because it's been, you know, it's been about, at first I feel like it's been about resisting the dominant media and like the stereotypes, but increasingly I just feel like that feels very defensive and reactionary, and can I just write for myself and not necessarily to represent anything or anyone, not necessarily to represent my community, but like just me, like as a person. And again, it goes back to personhood, and I just feel like for me, writing has definitely been healing, and it's definitely been about healing, and it's been about, you know, when you grow up in a culture or a community of like silence and shame and guilt for telling your own story, and even the ways in which I see children and young women and women being silenced for a lot of different things, I feel like by writing or by speaking my truths, it's like, you know, I don't want to sound like self-important, but in a way I feel like it is revolutionary in a sense, because it's like I feel like this generation of diaspora folks that are really like sharing some, you know, these experiences, like these traumatic experiences that were just never talked about in like our mom's generations or like in the past, you know? So for me, it's like I feel like it's kind of a burden, because in a way I'm like not only telling my story, it's like I'm telling my mom's story and my grandmother's story and the stories of the women in my community, and like it's a heavy burden, but it's also very cathartic and healing, because it's like shedding all of that baggage and shedding all of that pain, you know? But I also, the last thing I'll say is I also want to move away from like the pain complex too, because I feel like so many of us as African writers like pigeonhole ourselves, or we're pigeonholed, and I feel like the Black community as a whole to write about our pain, and I think that's because we've been through a lot of pain, but I'm also increasingly interested in like what would it be like to write about our joy?
Or to write about polar bears because you wanted
Or
to.
exactly.
Because we're in Minnesota.
Because we're in Minnesota. So yeah, so I'm like, it's a journey. It's constant self-exploration.
I think I definitely identify with some of these things that they're talking about. That sense of being forgotten within the larger narrative. I think arts, literature, history have a way of sort of enabling this massive forgetting. And to write and to speak to your narrative is to refuse to be forgotten.
Yes.
So that's really the big reason that I write. I also write to sort of demystify what it means to identify as a queer woman. So what it means to be a queer woman, what it means to be a queer African woman, what it means to be an immigrant, what it means to be a child of Africa in the 21st century. I think that we often have images projected of us that don't adequately represent us, and I want to give an adequate representation of the communities I belong to, and what they look like, and where our breaths take us from dawn to dusk. That's the thing that I want to do. I forgot the other parts of the question now.
Yeah.
Your intention. Yeah, I write to heal. That's definitely it. And I also write to bridge. I want to bridge these separate worlds that we think we live in. There's a tendency to sort of identify ourselves within certain geographical regions or certain just these really made up ideas of who we are. And I want my writing to show other people that they are connected to a greater world, and that we're all really not that different. And I think once you start to see other people much like you, you move yourself farther into the world, and that's where I want us to live within this greater fabric, and not these imaginary boundaries. So that's a big part of why I write. And I, again, also as a queer African woman, there's a huge responsibility on me to sort of speak a community into existence, especially on a continent that is very homophobic, and to sort of own your sexual identity as a child of Africa, I think is a very transformative experience, and it is also a very dangerous one. And I am privileged to live where I am and to be able to speak to that, and I take that very seriously, that I want to let people like me know that we are here, we can thrive, and I also want Africans to know that there are people like me, and I am also an African. So I think that kind of covers why I write.
Wow, yeah. I like what you said about bridging the worlds that we think we live in.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks.
Nemo passed the mic, so
Oh, she's
I just want to sit with that for a little
yeah. This is Adobe here. Talking about my writing journey. Wow, I started writing when. So a little bit about my story. I think that's. So I came here at a very young age. Actually, my dad came here first to get an education via Louisiana. So he went to Southern University, and then me and my mother came later. So a lot of my story, and I'm a big daddy's girl too. So a lot of my story, a lot of the things that I write about tend to have is unpacking the immigrant experience, unpacking issues that happen in the Nigerian community, but doing it with a lot of care. I'm of the thinking personally that there's always this, when I've taken a number of different, been in a number of different writing groups, and there's always this need, people are always pulling me to be more explicit and just name those things, and it's often coming from a very Western point of view, and I don't, and I always tell them, like, I don't need to do that. It sensationalizes to me the thing that I'm trying to say, the stories that I'm trying to tell, and I feel satisfied with the writing that I do. So there's no need to name this and say this is what this thing is. It's for you, the reader, to unpack that and do that work, is how I normally see that. I started writing when I was, gosh, man, I want to say like when I was in junior high school, and that only was correlated because I had a crush I had a crush on a guy, and I was so. So the situation is I didn't grow up with writers in I want to say that's because of the hardship that, so I come from a working class family, and being an immigrant, and we lost our status for a very long time. And so there was a lot of things that we were going through as far as
You lost your immigrant status?
immigrant status at the time, because my dad came in on a student visa, and so we lost that at some point in time. And so there was a while where we were so trying to be in the shadows and trying to provide for children, and so a hardship, it flows through a lot of the writing that I do. I don't know if I didn't see a lot of writing because my parents or the family members that I was around didn't write, or because of hardship they didn't have time to write. Writing in part is a luxury even in certain spaces. So to be able to carve out that time to do that. So when I started writing, it was because of a boy that I liked in junior high school, and I was trying to write those feelings down, and it was more journal writing. And I actually stopped writing a few years after that because my mom found my journal. And I remember
Obviously, a lot
coming
of us can
home.
relate to that, huh?
I remember coming home and my mom was like, Ada, what is this? And my face was, I didn't know what to do. But, you know, because there was a lot of tones, you know, intimate sexual sex and all that. And so writing about that at the age of 12, 13, my mom was very concerned. Yeah, so she burned my notebook.
Whoa.
Yeah, and so I didn't actually start writing again until, like, seriously writing again until I got into college and I studied journalism. But the writing I was doing at that point in time wasn't really storytelling. It was more just for, I mean, I did journalism because I wanted to write, and that was the only space that made the most sense for me to do that. So I didn't really jump back into creative writing until some years after I graduated. But yeah, a lot of my writing has to do with the immigrant experience. I weave in pieces of my stories in different characters that I play, but there's no one particular piece where it's like this is me throughout. I pull in from every body in my community, whether it's elders, whether it's my mom or my dad, especially the dynamics of their relationships and watching that transform as in this country in particular in a way that it probably wouldn't have if we had stayed back home. So I write about that. I write about my mom gists me a lot about things that are happening in our community, in our Nigerian community. So she's always telling me all the gossip and stuff that's happening. So I also pull from that as well, without naming names. But yeah, I feel, I don't know if I want to say I write to I write about the community, right? But I do it in a way that, I mean, some might see it as a little risque, but I do it in a way that is respectful because I'm very, and I don't know if that has to do with me being the oldest child and more so being the first daughter and the amount of responsibility there is in my culture in regards to that. So I'm very, and I don't need, again, people always are pressuring me to like almost out people in my writing, and I really don't feel a need to do that. Yeah. Yeah, I'll stop there. Yeah.
I have to say that I really love the piece that you had started working on about your dad. Are you going to ever finish that? It's so beautiful.
Yeah, I have my goal. If this is the only piece that I ever published, then I would be very satisfied. I want to write a piece about. It starts with my father, but it starts because my father fought in the Biafran War. And he doesn't really tell. A lot of people don't, even in our own community, a lot of people don't really know that. And I often watch my father because oftentimes he does this thing where he looks off in the distance, like he's looking at something, but I don't really know what he's looking at, and he's very historical in nature, so he's always looking at the past, and I just imagine what is he thinking about in regards to his time when he was young, his hopes he had when he came here, and how things didn't really pan out the way he wanted it to. And then also, so I want to write a piece where my dad is a novel where my dad is the main character, but it pulls in a lot of different people, not just from my family, but from the community. But I feel before I can actually write that piece, there's a lot of other work I need to do because I feel that's like a big piece to piece to do.
Yeah, it's pretty big. Okay.
Wow, I'm like trying to figure out what to contribute to this because you guys have said so much. Like a lot of my thoughts have already been spoken. I guess I'd I would say I really just write about like existing and being here, and like I feel like if there was a little Nemo that's gonna be here 30 years from now, she'll read something I wrote and be like, oh, okay, this is how I feel. So, and like I want to write about lightness. As you mentioned before, I want to write like about my mom's wit and like our jokes and just like we're just being, you know. And so that's really, really important for me. I mean, like, there's a lot of heaviness in the world. There's a lot that we've been through, but we're also like really joyful people, and we're having an amazing time with each other. We're having great conversation, and we're constantly like in negotiation with how to be human, and I'm really interested in that. This is gonna be on air, yeah. Because we've all gone in tangents, so I'm like, let me go there. Yeah, so I think in just being like of a Sufi mentality, it does take a lot of people to meet yourself, like, and there's at base 40 people. And so in arriving at that, we're constantly we're allowing other people to mirror ourselves and like to see ourselves. And we're doing that for people also. And like, what does that mean? How do you document that? So I'm really, really just interested in memory. I'm interested in documenting memory. And like, I'm in a panel with like a group of journalists. I don't know if you guys have, but I journal for myself. And like, I'm like, whoa, if I was like Emily Dickinson, like somebody's gonna find all these journals, all these writing, and it's gonna be crazy, but it's gonna be okay at the same time. and so like, it's weird because you're like, do I censor myself for myself also?
Right,
So
yep.
that like is also like a real mind trip. And so how do you write authentically? And I think the only way to do that is like if you live authentically out loud, and like how does your writing mirror your being and like how you show up in the world. And so I think that we're like constantly sort of growing. And our writing is doing that, and at the same time, we live also in a time where technology is really consuming our lives, and so we have a very strong need to tell our to explore and to expose ourselves constantly, and so there's like all sorts of like negotiations that are happening. And so do you journal out loud? Do you journal to yourself? Do you have conversations? I'm a conversationalist. I love talking to people because I really honestly do feel like this is how I meet myself. Is through other people, and like I'm constantly finding things about myself in conversation with other people, and that's really important to me, and like how I document that, and like how, you know, like all of you guys have said so many amazing things. That's like really the bridge. That's the human story. And it is, while it is about personhood, is also I'm interested in like that like tininess, that's being human, being a person, but then also being part of humanity. And there's so much in between, and that's like up for exploration. And I in terms of being pigeonholed, like you've all said it. It's like it's too easy. I'm like anytime somebody tries to pick up on a cliche and reiterate it and echo it, I'm like, you're so whack. That's too easy. Pick something else. You know, like seriously, like it's really, really basic. And I'm like, I've heard this so many times. How many different ways can you say this? So I'm actually, I feel sad for that person. I'm like, there are so many other things we could be talking about right now. Why are you like wasting space with this stuff?
Like,
you
how
know,
about
so
asking you what you want to write about?
I don't like it. Which is obviously, which is why it's really important for, I think, to have that individual story. And I'm actually just really interested in the individual story, and my individuality as a person, and those that just uniqueness, I think, is fascinating, and you should not take that away from people, no matter. Like we don't need to have boundaries with regards to that, or borders, or languages. It's like that's what writing does, and that's what we do. Yeah. But I think I'm gonna stop right there.
One more.
Yeah, tangents, yeah.
One more quick one, and then we'll open it up for questions. What is your relationship with African writers and writing, especially African women writers? I don't know if relationship is the right word or not, but yeah, maybe it is.
So I mean, I've was brought up reading quite a bit, and one of my first, there's a Kenyan woman called Grace Ogot. Okay, I'll back up first. I forget her name right now, but there is who wrote The Faraway Land? It's a fairy tale. Why can't I remember her name? Anyway, it's a British woman who, it turns out when I grew up later, I found out she's actually super conservative. And there was a lot of conservative messaging in her book. But she wrote a lot of fiction about fairy tales, and I think there was a forest somewhere, and kids would disappear in there and, play with elves. And so this is what I grew up on reading. Because of, again, colonialism. Yeah. But then my relatives of a certain age who were going through college in the 80s and the 90s were having this reawakening of, what it means to be Kenyan, what it means to be African. And at the time, there was a publisher called Heinemann who would publish the African Writers series. And so there were all these African writers from across the continent. Unfortunately, most of them were men. Some of them, Chinua Achebe, Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Those are the most known ones. But there were other smaller writers, not smaller writers, but unknown names that I grew up reading. So one of them is Grace Ogot, who actually died a couple of years ago. And what she did is she wrote very ordinary stories, stories about the people you see down the street. And as Carrie was saying, like there's sort of, so even with our class distinctions, Kenya has a huge, huge class gap between the upper middle class and low income. But even with that, there was still a lot of interaction between the classes in ways that actually I don't see it happen here outside the workplace. When I think of how, so I grew up upper middle class, and then I think about everyone I interacted with. Speaking again of identity and discomforts and unpacking what it means with what you carry. So even as a black woman in this country, I do carry a lot of privileges because of my, my family background and education and all that. And so a lot of what these women were writing were things that I could see. This idea of the invisible, black woman, or the hard, I never saw that in my family. The stories I hear about my grandmother, stories I hear about my, Lula, you were talking about, my own mother, my aunts, and in fact, if I think of anyone most of the people who were role models for me were women in my family. But again, back to the question of the African writers. So these women actually demonstrated that. Mariama Ba, who some of you might know, also she's from Senegal. Her books have been translated into English, but she originally wrote them in French and Wolof. Again, sort of like that constant retelling of ordinary life. And then in present time, there's lots of great African writers who sometimes their stories are not necessarily my story, but I'm just interested in what they're trying to say, whether with whatever their geographical framing is, their identities, the different stories. When we were preparing for this, I was talking about romance novels, like really horrible romance novels in Kenya that my siblings send them to me sometimes. Like they're really bad, so we'll have this long chain of emails where we're discussing how bad they are, which if anyone reads romance novels, you know that, there's full of cliches and comedy for days. So, I read all that stuff. I read everything from the highly intellectual academic papers to like the trashy novels. So, and I also read American and British writers and Jamaican writers and whoever else in between. But yeah, I really strongly follow the particularly Kenyan literary scene.
Does anybody want it, or I can just go, whatever.
You want to go?
Yeah, so the question was African writers. Well, I didn't grow up with reading anything by African writers. So my little immigration story is I was born in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and but I still had a strong connection to Ethiopia, which is where my parents were born and raised, because we'd go visit every summer. And sometimes every winter too. So we would spend at least, a quarter of the year in Africa. So I had that connection growing up. Never seen Eritrea, so I don't have a personal connection to it. And but when I was in Saudi Arabia, I was, I guess you could also say we kind of grew up middle class, relatively speaking. And I went to an American school, so the literature that I read was all Western. And even growing up, like I can say the reason that I started getting into reading books was actually because of my mom, because she, in Ethiopia as a child would like read, English books. So that's something people don't really know is English is actually one of the official languages taught in schools in Addis Ababa, in the capital. So English is like my mom's second language. She reads and writes and everything. And I really think, despite her, given her circumstances, she didn't, go into writing. But I really think like my mom's a storyteller at heart. And like, I think for a lot of women in that generation, like had they had the right opportunities and privileges, I really think that they would have been able to pursue creative dreams and goals, but it's that things didn't, align for them, because so much of what they were trying to do was just like survive and take care of their families, I mean, right? So I think like my mom has never said this, but I really think it was a dream of hers to be a writer. Because growing up, like she was the one that would always tell us stories about her childhood and growing up in Ethiopia, and days of like when she would, she played for like her soccer team, and how she would, defy her parents' rules and like cut her hair super short, and just like all these things, like she was a rebel, you know what I mean? And I think about all these stories and I'm just like, wow, like A, my mom is a storyteller, and B, I totally get my rebellious streak from her, and but anyway, I'm digressing. So she was the reason I started reading and writing to the way that I do, like in terms of how much, I'm passionate about it, because I remember being like, again, 6 or 7, and she would just like come home and like buy all these books for me. Like I wouldn't even ask, and it was like, but again, it was like white books. So it was like Disney books and, Harry Potter. I mean, that was when I was older, like 9 or 10. Harry Potter and like the Chronicles of Narnia and things about like Arthurian legend and like Merlin. And so that was the stuff I was reading as a kid, was like very European, very British, very colonial stuff, Yeah, like Lord of the Rings, just a lot of those types of magic, fairy tales, stuff like that.
So the Western stuff that you read did
like
not include African American writers.
It didn't include African American because we weren't exposed to that, you know what I mean? And but the irony is, when I hit college and I started, like, I guess I would say learning my blackness, I was for the first time exposed to African American writers, and before I was even exposed to African writers. So even now, I would say that in terms of writers, I'm more familiar with like African American women writers than I am even African women. And so it's like a constant journey of just like learning your own history and learning, who came before you and their stories. And I think a big part of it too is just an issue of like language and accessibility. I don't read in my native languages, so it's again like what's available in English, what's available to you where you're at, where can you purchase certain things, you know what I mean? And then I had another thought too about, yeah, and then just the idea of storytelling. I think that I come from a family of storytellers too, because if you look at just culturally, we have something called like tarat tarat, and I don't know the exact definition, but it kind of means like storytelling, and it's a call and response sort of a thing. So it's usually when you have like family time and you're kind of gathered together, and you know, the storyteller will say tarat tarat, and then the people who are listening will say yelam barat, and it's kind of like, you know, you're telling a story, you know, and you're engaged, it's interactive. And so I grew up around that, you know, so I didn't necessarily read African writers growing up, but the art of storytelling was something that was instilled in me from childhood, you know, from my mom and from my family. So so yeah, I guess writing is just like taking it to the next level, if that makes sense. But in terms of writers that I love right now, in terms of African writers, I will say like Warsan Shire, who's a poet, Somali, Kenyan, and British, I think, is someone that I really look up to in terms of poetry, and she's kind of in our age group. And I think Ladan Osman, who I think you know, also Somali. So, yeah, I think I'll stop there for now.
So I want to make sure that we have time for a couple of questions. So if you guys could just make your last responses kind of brief.
I remember the name of the children's author, Enid Blyton. That's who it is.
Okay.
This is Adobe here. As far as African writers, or I ditto a lot of the sentiments in regards. I mean, I think folks don't know how much colonialism really played in regards to access to what stories you would read. I always joke with folks in my community that, you know, Nigerians can read Shakespeare like it ain't nobody, like no, and when I say that outside, people don't understand. But those are like the pieces that folks had access to. As far as writing, being even a writer, particularly for Igbo people, there's a lot of writers now, but especially when you're coming from hardship, and you're the eldest, right? There's high levels of pragmatism that is expected. So we always joke that there's always 5 careers that you as a Nigerian have access to. You can either be a lawyer, you can be a doctor, an engineer, multiple kinds of engineer, electrical engineer, but name all of them. And all of so those really that's about is centered on trying to further and advance your family and community, something that's very for certain or perceived to be for certain, right? Chasing something that's a creative career is oftentimes seen as irresponsible. I remember when I told my dad I was majoring in journalism, he said, "Great, you can't go to law school with that." and so, and even to this day, my dad is not really sure what I'm doing.
I can relate to that.
But and I'm okay with that, right? But yeah, so as far as, you know, African writers and African having access to that, I feel, you know, especially within the last 5 to 7 years, I've really just been really consuming, like intentionally searching and consuming that work. I mean, everybody knows Chinua Achebe and Christopher Okibo and some of these other folks. But then, and not to even talk about African women writers, that's really, I think the males really dominate the space. So yeah, really intentionally searching out for that. And I think until I really feel grounded in that work, I question how much I'm able to pursue certain pieces in my personal narrative, right?
Interesting. Okay.
I want to respond to something that Lula said. She mentioned her mother being a storyteller and sort of telling these stories, and I really want to counter the assertion that only the people on stage sitting here are writers. I think that any person who is documenting their life, investigating it, and is doing some form of recording that is engaged in writing, and they are writers. So I want to assert that. As far as my relationship to African writers, I grew up in the same country as Julia, so I was lucky enough to be exposed to African writers for my entire educational system. The literature we studied in classrooms was of African writers. I was not exposed to Shakespeare or classic literary books until I came here, and I was like, I don't really know what you're talking about. Yeah. So I am lucky enough in that regard. I do not recall a lot of these writers' names, rather unfortunately, and most of them were men. I have been influenced deeply by the writing of Black women writers. Alice Walker is a woman who inspires me tremendously, and a long list of names that I'm sure you're all familiar with. But I am also really, I'm a consumer of words. I want to consume words wherever they are, which I sort of mentioned in my opening piece, like sort of trying to find all these pieces and make them into who I am. So with that, there are two writers in particular of African descent. One is Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and his book Decolonizing the Mind is something that really haunts my creative existence and really challenges me in the means that I create my writing. And I think the challenge to African writers to sort of create in our language is something that I really struggle with, because we are losing that, and that's a really big thing. The other writer who has really influenced me is Frantz Fanon. His book, The Wretched of the Earth, really spoke to me about what it means to be colonized. That's something that we're not taught. We're taught the important dates, we're taught the historical figures, but in terms of what that does to your psyche individually and collectively, it's something that is missing. And he gave me that legitimization that I needed to be angry. It was okay for me to feel cheated, and really how that affected me. And the thing that Fanon spoke to that also really I just would like to share is that oftentimes as colonized peoples or as oppressed peoples, there's this internalized fear that we have of the colonizer. And Fanon sort of flipped the script on this and said, actually, the colonizer should be afraid of the person he's colonizing. Because within a marginalized person lies the power of revolt, lies a revolution, lies the ability to upend everything that you think you know. And to take claim to that is something that I really hold dearly.
Amen. Right. Ooh. Yeah.
That was, I'm a processor too. Like, that's a lot. So the first language I think that I learned to read and write in is Arabic. I'm Muslim. I grew up as that, and so like a lot of the stories, a lot of my childhood was like really enriched with Somali and Arabic narrative. I wasn't exposed to like Western narrative until like really, I would say probably the age of 10 maybe. But even then, I think I just kind of always knew who to identify with and how to identify. And just going to the library, I was kind of like, I don't know, I just followed my flow to like the African American literature section, like, and I was interesting. Like, one of the first books I've ever bought was Langston Hughes, and I was 14. And I was rearranging my bookshelf the other day. I was like, I bought this at 14. Whoa. And so there's just, I think, something really about the upbringing and like family and the stories that you told, and like that I think that as long as you're alive, you're constantly like investigating your identity. And so I'm still with that. That's still like a search. But some of the things that kind of lets me know that I'm headed the right direction, it is what I consume. It is being like in spaces like this. And just kind of the conversations that come up, or, in terms of, I'm gonna keep it really short. People I'm reading right now, people that recently, because I think being Somali, we're an oral tradition. Our writers are very recent. People are reading right now, and our identity is also because of the chaos, because of this like being in the world. As as much as people like to think that Somalis are one-dimensional, we're like really diverse. And so like one of the people I'm reading is Cristina Farah, who's a Italian Somali writer, Little Mother. Another person that I'm reading right now is Nadifa Mohammed, who's a British young writer. You've mentioned some of the poets; they're amazing. Levin, who was here actually, shout out to Bao. She's in this space. She's a poet from Chicago who's also Somali. And then Warsa Shire, who's like a very dynamic poet as well. I do seek out women writers. And I do heavily. Marima Ba, like I read that also at a young age. I just happen to stumble on things, and I'm like really happy that that happens, or have like really amazing people in my life that kind of throw a book my way. Be like, yo, you should read this, Nemo. I'm like, thank you. Don't know what this means right now, but like later on, I'm like, this is why I needed to read it. And this is, sometimes I hear stories, it doesn't make sense to me right away, and then like 5 years, 2 years later, I'm like, this is why I heard that story. It makes sense to me now. It's informing my, like, what it is that I'm experiencing. And so, I'm not sure where I'm headed with that, but I'm just gonna end it there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Cool.
All right. We So we're running a little late, so maybe just a couple of questions? Yes, ma'am.
I have this question. Well, I've been observing the oral tradition part. I think that a lot of us from the African diaspora have this strong connection to oral storytelling from our elders. And so I'm wondering, it's specifically directed to Ada. Well, everyone's welcome to answer. How do you, because there's such light, I have this sister that, you know, she just lights up when she's doing the oral storytelling piece, and the writing tends to be just a little heavier. And some of those nuances that are so alive in oral storytelling that really really tell the story of so many people. Is there an effort made to bridge those two pieces, that oral tradition piece and that literary piece?
Great question.
Amazing question.
Are you low key talking about me? I know, wisdom. Yeah, I think as an oral storyteller, right? And that's the tradition of writing. I mean, the tradition of that's what I'm accustomed to, right? Telling stories in very dynamic ways, because I'm normally trying to solicit a reaction as part of that fellowship. So when I'm writing though, and the elements of the interaction is not there, I go very inward, right? I think, let me back up a little bit. I think I'm just thinking about all the community gatherings and the storytelling that we're doing in those spaces. People aren't necessarily coming with their hardships in those spaces. They're kind of pecking, because nobody really wants to tell about what's going on in their household, right? Like nobody wants to shed light on that. So it's always about telling these stories and or these situations, and it becomes very partially entertaining, partially revealing. And writing is a very personal thing, right? You're not necessarily, at least for me, I'm not necessarily writing for any particular reaction. So I'm not, so I'm addressing things that I wouldn't address in public, or I'm talking about things I wouldn't talk about in public. And a lot of that is, I guess, partially healing and talking about how I've seen hardship either affect my family or other people's families, and those are not the type of stories that I would necessarily engage with orally in the Niger community in any kind of way. And I don't know, and I feel that's something that in a lot of immigrant households and that there's just this aspect of maintaining a level of privacy and not shedding light on what's happening in your own backyard. Yeah.
All right.
Can I answer that?
Go ahead.
So like normally if I'm doing a reading or something, like I like to infuse it with some sort of just like freestyle storytelling. Because we do put a lot of emphasis on writing. Because we're like, oh, I don't know where this is gonna go. This is an imprint. But I think there's just something really natural about that improv, that just like relating of just telling it, I think it's really beautiful, mostly because it's very vulnerable. You don't know where it's gonna go. You're like, I'm in this bus, headed, I don't know where, but I'm trying to tell this story. And there is, I think when we do that, we are channeling something bigger than us. We're maybe possibly channeling our ancestors, our mothers. I think that there is like this richness to it, and I do hope that that is like a tradition that we continue to like hang on to and appreciate. This storytellers. Yeah, this is a panel for writers, but storytellers are they're bomb.
And the last quick thing I would add to that is I think we kind of are doing that work because we are bridging. I feel like we are the bridge between the sort of like traditions of oral storytelling that we came from, and then combining that with our like writing backgrounds. A lot of what, I'll speak for myself, a lot of what I feel like I'm doing is documenting stories that my mother has just passed down to me, or even just experiences or themes that come out in our conversations, and these aren't things that she would necessarily think to write down, but as a writer, I'm thinking, whoa, like, that would make a really good story, you know what I mean? So I feel like actually we are sort of the generation that's doing that, where we're the bridge between the generations, between the diasporas, between the forms of, sharing, whether that's writing, oral, whatever.
I would even add that I feel I record my parents low key. Don't tell them. When
I do it
but
too.
and when I and when I when I go home, because I try to go home as much as I can. I'm actually looking forward to going home very soon. But I record like my aunties and uncles low key, like, and I do that to kind of figure out how to inject that oral component that you're talking about into the writing, right? And I haven't figured how to do that yet, but I think capturing that. Documenting that in some kind of way is kind of the first step I'm taking in that.
I saw a hand over here. I thought I did, yeah. You first, yeah. Hi.
Ladies, I would like to ask if all your stories and your writing, do you do them in only English, or do you also do them in your dialects, your original languages? Thank you.
Unfortunately, I only write and communicate in English. Well, I can do intersperse with Shang, which is a Swahili street language, but I don't publish that. That's like, when people are talking about forms of storytelling, I was actually thinking about how technology has really changed how we communicate. And so, I have like 10 WhatsApp messages on my phone that are, actively going, and half the people I'm talking to are back home, and how we tell each other stories like as dramatically as possible. And so that means not just using English, because sometimes English is super inadequate. You will not be, so it's, but I, like professionally, I haven't actually. I think and write in English.
Yeah, I'll just answer that quickly. I write in English, but I do kind of intersperse some of my poems with some Amharic or Tigrinya words in there that have some sort of cultural significance. But pretty much English. Yeah.
And I also only primarily write in English. I would like someday when somebody gives me enough money to go work somewhere on my own to actually learn how to write in my other languages. I think it's something I would like to do sometime in the future.
I guess I would say some English. Like, part of the work that I'm doing right now is exploring Somali poetry and proverbs. So I do have to write in proverb and decipher those proverbs and poetry. And so, yeah, I wouldn't the deciphering of it is my language or like my Somali words, but I think the proverbs and the poetry itself is not mine. But in terms of my personal writing, I think it just mirrors who I am right now. So it's a mixture of just English, Somali, Arabic, Nemo, just like stuff that don't make sense. I'm also really interested in creating language. I'm like, who came up with English? Somebody did. Why can't we create? Why can't we create our own language? I mean, like,
So you
yeah.
might as well create Nemo, huh? As a language.
I write predominantly in English, but I intersperse a lot of Igbo proverbs in the writing, and I mean that's such a that's a conversation that's happening right now amongst African writers in regards to weaving in our native and indigenous languages, but a lot of that is really determined by where you're getting published and who's going to publish you. So and those folks tend to be in the West, but so I intersperse it. Yeah.
Okay, one more question, and I saw the lady in black. Didn't you have your hand up? Yeah.
My three of them. I'm like, what's that?
So my question is, I have a Togolese friend, and he said that he finds African women who live in America, their thoughts are very strange. How does living in the U.S. and being part of this contemporary culture influence your writing as African writers?
Wow. Ooh. Okay.
So that's hello to your Togolese friend.
Question.
That's Maya, by the way.
So that's actually interesting because my mother was considered strange because she was, she lived in the city. But she never traveled. I mean, she did travel abroad later in her life, but she lived in Kenya her whole life. And so I think I think I'd mentioned this earlier, there is this insistence that we don't progress or that we don't move or that other things that are only Western are the only things that influence us. But we are influenced constantly by so much in our lives. I keep going back to colonialism, and if you think about the impact that had, your Togolese friend probably speaks French, and so what impact has the French had on him? What has colonialism had on his food or his language or whatever? So men, leave us alone.
I have nothing to add to that. Men, leave us alone.
No. Wow.
I have nothing to add.
Me neither.
All right, then we'll take Mary's question, and then we're going to take a break.
Very brief. Julia, you said that you have several conversations going on now on your phone in which you use Swahili slang, street language.
Yes.
Could you say something? Could we hear something?
What does that sound like?
Okay, Shiro. They call you Shiro.
Oh God.
Can we have a conversation?
I feel
very conflicted about this question, and I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to call you out, Mary, because this is something that happens very frequently to foreigners or immigrants or African people, where we are asked to sort of speak, to show off. You know, it's like, here, give us a little bit of a show. However, I will give in. But just to let you know, unataka niseme nini? Nimeongea Swahili sasa hivi, unataka niseme nini?
Twende tudishi.
Haki twende, nani kuna nini? Hata sijui.
Yeah. This is Adobe. I'll ditto
The
that.
Kenyans in the house, I hope we didn't embarrass you. I know there are a couple of you here.
To speaking to that question, I oftentimes, so I try to avoid groups that, book groups, book reading groups where African writers are on the table and there's not African people in the space. Because there was a group it was a person I was working with that invited me to their book club. And I said, yeah, I'll come. And then they sent, I said, yeah, I'd come. And then they sent the first book, and it was Chinua Achebe's book. And then I said, I don't think I'm going to come to that. Because I knew that would be a setup in the sense of I was going to be asked to translate things. I was going to be asked to speak and give this educational. And so, yeah, I don't, because I've been asked by bosses to say things in my native language, and I just don't do that. Because it's not, it's what is it for you? Like, how does this help you in any kind of way? Yeah, so.
I'm commenting on that because I'm interested. I was interested as well, not because I want you to put on a show, but I'm Conese. I feel this is what I've found in my travels. Africans from all over this world have similarities, and we in America, we speak Ebonics. That's our own dialect. And so we have to code switch when we go to work and different. So I think it's a commonality. I really do. And I'm a little, I am emotional. That's because I'm an emotional being. I think it's beautiful. I think it's a beautiful thing that we share, that we have dialects. And no matter where you go, all over the world. And I think the richness, I think one of you said that English limits you, but when you go into your dialect, when you go into your, I can't remember the word that you used the slang, that's when you can really, because there's a lot of things I can't express just in plain English, but when I break it down into my Ebonics, I guess, is the best way to describe it, then it comes across, and I think it's very poetic, and I think that's why rappers speak, in their own native tongue, basically. So please don't, at least in this group, please don't think we're here to, you know what I'm saying, to front you off. There I go, front you off. We're not going to do that.
I was unaware of what I would be uncovering by asking that question. And I'm glad to be reminded of it. I would like to say that one of my interests as a writer is in the sound of the words and the way that they fit together. And so my interest in hearing it is hearing something from you that I cannot access any other way, though I have something to offer in return.
All right. Okay. That's it. Okay. You all right? All right, go ahead.
And I just want to respond to what Mary said. I think that we all kind of have a gut reaction to certain questions, and to hear the context then sort of changes how you think about that. So thank you for clarifying that. Appreciate it.
All right.
But I would also add that I think, and I'm generalizing a little bit, but I think African people are always meant to have, like, people feel that they can access African people in a certain way. And I feel that that there's some colonial aspect of that, in the sense of like I'm free to poke and open and dive into any aspect of that, and I don't see that play out in other cultures, so that tends to be why I have a certain gut reaction to that, because I don't feel people are asked to explain things when in other settings, right? And I feel that there's a colonial aspect in regards to what kind of access do I have to this person.
Okay.
Sorry.